We're back on our series, our Not a Fan series. We're still diving into what it means to define the relationship of being a follower of Jesus, not just a fan of Jesus. We've been kind of bouncing back and forth on that, but hopefully we'll be able to continue going on that on through the summer. I think we're only going to miss a couple of Tuesday nights from now all the way through summer, so look forward to everybody coming back out and being with us each and every week. But this week we're going to be looking at a topic: what target are you aiming at? What are you aiming at in your life? And the first question, and we can solicit response to this, is when have you ever totally missed your target or objective? Anybody? Totally missed? Anybody? Nothing. It's fine. Nobody's ever missed their target or an objective? Nobody's ever had that? Had something come up there? Nobody? Wow, y'all are a lot better than me. Almost all the time when you're duck hunting? Yeah. A lot of the time when you're duck hunting?
One time I shot at one duck 3-4 times and didn't touch a feather on it.
Oh. Well, I've never shot a duck a day in my life, so I'd have a hard time understanding what that even means. But I've never hunted a day in my life, so go ahead, Ryan.
You know those raffles you can do at like basketball games?
Sure.
You pay $1 and you get your name in the pot and they draw out for like some kind of like a half-court shot for a prize.
Yes.
Well, at my high school for a homecoming my senior year, I was like, why not try it? I can't remember, it was like $1,000 or something. So I put $1 in, put my name in, and I get drawn to shoot a half-court shot homecoming in front of the stands, and I airball. And people not only did I airball, but then our student section chanted airball in chorus. It was not one of the brighter moments of my life.
Yeah. Totally missed the target.
It looked beautiful though.
Hey.
It came up that short.
Came in there. Anybody else have anything they'd like to share or add or whatever? Does anybody know of a gentleman by the name of Rod Regal? Rod Regal. Anybody heard of Rod Regal? Close, but that's not quite there yet. Rod Regal was a football player that played for the California Bears back in 1929. In 1929, they only had one bowl game in college football, and it was the Rose Bowl. Still going today. Now we got 40 bowl games, and Tennessee still can't make one, so it's pretty bad. But they only had one bowl game back then. Of course, it wasn't on TV. It was on the radio. But it was the Rose Bowl. It was the biggest game of the year. And Rod Regal was playing linebacker for the Cal Bears, but he also played center. They didn't have enough players to play, so they had to play on both sides of the ball. And they were playing Georgia Tech, and it was a 0-0 tie in the second quarter. And Rod Regal squared up a Georgia Tech running back as he was making a turn around the end and formed up a tackle and caused a fumble. And he picked it up and took off. And as he was running, a guy kind of bumped him and kind of got him off kilter. And all the people that were in front of him when he first started running, when he got up and looked, there was nobody there. So he had a free run to the end zone. Unfortunately, what Rod Regal was doing is he was running to the wrong end zone. He was running to his own end zone as opposed to the Georgia Tech end zone. And eventually one of Cal's other players tackled him at the 1-yard line before he scored. But the next play, they were tackled for a safety, and they ended up losing the game 8-7, all because of the safety from Rod Regal running the wrong way. And Rod spent the rest of his life, he was an accomplished man. He ended up going and starting his own business and becoming an extremely wealthy man. But he was always remembered for one thing, and that was running the wrong way in the Rose Bowl. Now what's interesting about Rod is that Rod did everything right on the play. He did everything you were supposed to do. He made the tackle, recovered the fumble, picked it up, took off running. So if you look at from that outside looking in, he did everything right. But the problem was he ran towards the wrong target at the end. And I think that's kind of what we're looking at today and kind of what we get into today when we're looking at either being a fan of Jesus or an actual follower of Jesus is sometimes we can do everything the right way. We can do it, we can study the right way, we can put all of our effort into the right things, but the target that we're trying to meet in the end is the wrong target. We're targeting a legalistic view or a rules-based view or something different as opposed to actually targeting what Jesus called us to do. So that's what we're going to be looking at tonight is that how can we make sure our focus in what we're doing is actually focused on the right target, and that's following Jesus the way that He called us to follow Him. So we're going to be in Matthew 23, and I'm going to read just the first 13 verses. It's actually a complete sermon, but it really gets a little bit deep in here, and I think we can kind of hit the highlights of it going just to the first 13 verses. But kind of give you an idea where we're at here. This is kind of towards the end of Matthew. This is one of Jesus' last sermons. He knows it's going to be one of His last sermons because He knows He's coming to the point where He's going to be crucified. And this is a sermon that He doesn't preach to just the normal people. He ends up preaching this sermon to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin was a group of men that was kind of like a synod almost. They were the religious leaders, the priests, all the people in that time that actually spoke to other individuals. And they kind of held themselves in high regard because of that. And you had two different groups. You had the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the two of them, they didn't really get along. One of them was a little more conservative, one of them was a little more liberal. One group kind of got their position because of who their family was, because of where they grew up at. The other one had to work really hard to get where they were at by studying and gathering up all this knowledge to show that they were welcome. But the issue is they were taking the words of Jesus and twisting it around. And instead of pointing people towards following Jesus, they were pointing people towards following all these rules and objectives and all these just legalistic things that were making it really hard for people to follow Jesus. And Jesus had enough of it at this point. So He's actually coming out here, and if you read the entire passage, He gives them a pretty scathing rebuke. It reminded me a lot of last Wednesday night when Ryan gave a pretty scathing rebuke to most of the students there. If you hadn't had a chance to watch it, go back and watch it on YouTube, because he just laid it all out, which is what they needed to hear. Sometimes these kids get a little propped up, and they need to hear the truth. So this is what Jesus does right here. He just lays it all out there and tells them the truth. So we're going to pick up in the first verse. A couple of words in here I don't know really well, so I'm just going to skip over them because my pronunciation is not the best. We already know that as it is. So we're just going to let it go. So then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to His disciples. The scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. Therefore, do whatever they tell you and observe it. But don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they teach. They tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry and put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. They do everything to be observed by others. They enlarge their whatever and lengthen their tassels. They love the place of honor at banquets, the front seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called rabbi by people. But as for you, do not be called rabbi, because you have one teacher and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, because you have one Father who is in heaven. And do not be called masters either, because you have one master, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You lock up the kingdom of heaven from people, for you don't go in, and you don't allow those entering to go in. Now, if we continued reading, he would actually go through 6 more of these but woe to you scenarios. In fact, he pretty much laid that out all the way down. But in the effort of time, we're not going to go all the way through that. We're going to just kind of stop right there and go through. But I think we see 3 different things from this passage that will kind of help us define what our target is and what our target and direction we're looking to go for. And the first thing we see is, it says, following Jesus requires authenticity. It requires you to be authentic. So how would you define the word hypocrite? Anybody? It's a classic word everybody loves, because most people won't come to church because they're all a bunch of hypocrites, right? We've all heard that before, probably. But how would you define the word hypocrite? Say one thing to another, yeah. Sure. Not practicing what they preach. Wow. Carrie, good answer. So, the word hypocrite, the term hypocrite actually came from, back in those days in the theater, they didn't allow a lot of people to play characters in the theater. They didn't let women play a character at all. So, what would happen is the same one person would end up playing multiple characters. He would end up playing 4 or 5 different characters, and he'd have a different mask for every character that he played, so you couldn't tell that it was the same person playing that. And that's where the word hypocrite actually came from, because it was somebody that was continuously wearing a mask and pretending to be somebody that they weren't. They were pretending to be something different than what they actually were. And those masks that they were using would cover up whatever that they had there. So what we see here is what Jesus is talking about here is all of these leaders back there, they weren't very authentic. They were saying one thing and acting one thing, but they were doing it and then living a different way when those people weren't around. They wanted the glory when they were in front of people, but they didn't want to act that way when they were around another set of people. And it's the same deal that we get into a lot, because I think if anybody in here would guess that you would probably, if you're honest, say that you've probably got some different masks that you wear. You've got a mask that you wear if you're at church or if you're in Sunday school. You may have a different mask that you wear with your friends or if you're out somewhere. You may have a different mask that you wear if you're in a classroom setting or in a college setting than what you have somewhere else. And the problem we get into is the more masks we have and the more things that we wear, the harder it is to actually figure out what our true identity is, right? But to be a true follower of Jesus, you have to be authentic to everything that you do. I didn't have this analogy up until a couple of days ago, but when I thought about authenticity, it made me think of a good man that we just lost this week, Mr. Tony Walker. A true definition of an authentic Christian was Tony Walker. And the reason I say that is because I'm sure what Rob and his family are hearing a lot is a lot of things that Tony did for a lot of people that nobody knew about, that nobody heard about, that nobody understood, that even his family didn't even know about. And it's because Tony was doing things because that's what God called him to do, not doing things because he wanted somebody to give him the glory for it. Because he knew that the ultimate glory was living out what God had told him to do and following Jesus the way that you're truly supposed to follow Jesus. You see, we have a lot of people out here that love to say they want to serve, or love to say that they follow Jesus, or love to say that they're doing what Jesus called them to do. And then the minute they do something, they want everybody to come and tell them how awesome they were at doing it. They want to tell them that they were great and pat them on the back. And then they want to make sure every conversation they have for the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, they let everybody know, hey, you hear about what I did? You hear about me helping this guy? Or you hear about me serving this guy? Or you hear about this or that? And that's not authentic Christianity. That's not what Jesus called you to do. Nothing that we're doing is for our glory. Everything we're doing is for the glory of Jesus and His kingdom. And that's what these guys were doing back then. And that's why Jesus is coming down so hard on them. Because they are not living the authentic life that He has called them to live. And because of it, it's making it difficult for people to actually follow Jesus. It's making it hard for them to follow it. And the reason that is because of what we see with the second point. It's following Jesus does not require having it all together. It doesn't require having it all together. That's the greatest thing that you'll ever be told if you're going to follow Jesus, is that it does not require you to have your life all together to come and follow Him. You see, these different groups back then, they were coming up with all of these different rules and different things that you had to do. And you couldn't come to do and serve if you didn't meet this rule and that rule and this rule and that rule and all these different things. So what happened was most people just wouldn't follow. It was too hard. They were making it too difficult to follow Jesus because they were making it like you had to have your life all together, when in reality, Jesus wants you to come without your life all together because He's going to put it together for you. The number one reason and I've read this in a couple of different things now, but the number one reason we see people that fall out of the church or that go through church, through high school, through college, through all these, and then ended up going away, it's not because they didn't understand who Jesus was. It's not because they didn't understand what they were called to do. It's because the church in our society has put so many rules on them that they feel like it's impossible for them to follow. So it's easier for them just to not. It's easier for them just to turn and walk the other way because we've made it feel or seem like that following Jesus is an impossible thing to do. And that's not the case at all. Following Jesus should be really the easiest thing for you to do. Now, that doesn't mean your life's going to be easy, but God gives you the grace to follow Him because He's going to let you come to Him no matter how you are. And I say this because I went out on many a faith visit over my time. And what I've seen is, if you've went to church, or if you've been around somebody that went to church, you know how to answer my questions. Now, that doesn't mean you understand what I'm asking you, and that don't mean you have committed to what I'm asking you, but you know how to answer my questions. But I've went to a lot of people that don't know anything about it, and what their number one response always is when you start to share what it means to follow Christ is, well, I'm going to do that, but I've got to get my life together first. They believe because someone has told them or someone has explained to them that they have to have their life together before they come to Christ. And it's not the case. If you start pointing somebody at a target that has all these different rules on it, then they're never going to hit it. And you're pointing them in the wrong direction. You point them towards the actual truth of the message, which is you come to Jesus no matter how you are and allow Him to come in and truly push you in the direction you're supposed to go. And then that's when it becomes Him putting your whole life back together. So we see that following Jesus requires authenticity. Following Jesus requires having it all together. And the last thing, where pretty much the whole basis of everything is, where we're going to spend the most amount of time, is following Jesus requires outer appearance to align with inner passion. Outer appearance to align with your inner passion. So I am kind of one of these dudes that, I like to have a little afternoon snack to get me through the day. Okay. Now, I got this from Carrie Jones because she has to eat every 2 hours, or she turns into Scary Jones. Anyway, so normally I don't get to eat dinner most nights till 6, 7, 8 o'clock. Sometimes I don't ever have time. Last night they threw me a cheeseburger at the ball game at 9 o'clock because they were running out and they were free, so I ate one because I hadn't ate anything since lunch. But I like to have an afternoon snack because if I don't have the afternoon snack, who knows when I'll get to eat again. And one of my favorite snacks that I've got back used to eating is an apple. I love to eat an apple. Now, there's 80,000 different variations of apples. There's so many, I can't even keep them all apart. But the one I like the most is the Golden Delicious apple. It's Golden Delicious. Katie likes the Golden Delicious. And some people don't like it, but that's the one I like. Anyway, that sweet, yes, good stuff. If you don't like the Golden Delicious, try it again. Give it another shot. Anyway, so here a couple weeks ago, I had a Golden Delicious apple, and I like to have a little peanut butter with it. Just kind of, spice it up a little bit. So I have my peanut butter out, I have my apple ready, man, I'm fired up. This thing is clean, it's just shining in the wind here. So I peel the outer peeling, I peel that outer peeling, right? And inside of it, man, it's brilliant, it's just great. I am so pumped up about this apple, right? Because I'm ready to eat this. I take a bite of it, and what happens? The inside of the core is rotten to the core. It's just terrible. I mean, it's brown times this table brown. I mean, it's just bad. It's just the worst thing you've ever seen in your life. Now, here's the thing. If you looked at that apple on the outside, it looked as brilliant as it could be. And even when you took that first initial peeling off of it, it still looked really good. But what happened when you actually got to the core of the apples? Would you find out what the apple was actually made of? And it wasn't any good. It wasn't any good. And it spoiled the rest of the apple because of it. And that's the same thing that we get into when our outer appearance doesn't match up with the passion that's on the inside of us. When we're actually going through and pretending to be a follower of Jesus, when truly we're actually just a fan of who Jesus is. We're not actually committed to following Him. We're just a fan of His name and what everybody thinks that we should do. There's a lot of people that you'll run into, that I run into, that everybody else runs into, that will look the part and will look it really good. Man, they'll say all the right things, they'll do all the right things, they'll go all the right ways, and you'll think they're right there, and then you'll see something happen. You'll see some adversity come into their life, or you'll see something that just doesn't go their way. And then you'll see what really is on the inside and what's really at the core of who they are. And it's not a true follower of Jesus. It's somebody that's just pretending to be a follower of Jesus and just actually just a fan of Jesus. So if you want to understand what target you're aiming at, the first place you've got to look is where your actual passion is at. When you're serving, or when you've been asked to serve, are you serving because that's what God's called you to do, or are you serving because you might get some glory out of it? When you're asked to go out and to do something, are you doing it because you might get the front seat at the common grounds? You might get the front seat at the church. You might get to be the guy that everybody comes over and has to ask you if it's okay to do something. You might be in that leadership. Are you doing it because of that? Or are you doing it because that's what Jesus has actually called you to do? What He's actually put into your life to go forward and actually step out and do in faith. So the question is, are you more focused on your outside appearance more than your inside appearance? You see this a lot in our world today. Everybody's worried about what their house looks like, what their yard looks like, how their kids are dressed. Obviously, I'm not, because my kids go out of the house most of the time not even matching clothes on. So, and that's not on my wife, that's on me, because I let them do it. You know, I get them ready for church on Sunday, and sometimes it doesn't pan out to the right method. Sometimes their hair is like this. But I'm not worried about the outside appearance. I'm just worried about if they get there or not. That's all I'm worried about. But we see this all the time. We see people that miss the point of Christianity because they're so worried about their appearance in front of others, or they're so worried about their appearance in things that they forget that that's not what they're actually called to do, and that's not what following Jesus actually looks like. Following Jesus looks like you putting your life in His hands and doing whatever He calls you to do, no matter what you get in return for it. I think I've said it in here before, but I serve on the AV committee at church. If you ever wanted to be on a committee that's the most non-think committee in the world, be on the AV committee, because the only time anybody knows you're there is when something screws up. And then, not only that, they want to tell you, hey, you screwed that up. Now, they won't tell you, oh, you did it right for the last 51 weeks, you just screwed it up this week. That's all they'll tell you. And then you'll go back to your hole, and then 51 more weeks will go fine, and then nobody will speak to you again. It's fine. No, I'm kidding. The AB committee's great. Everybody loves it. But that's what you get into there. So I always like to use that because I'm an AV guy, and that's the way I feel. I like to mix that in whenever I can. I said I was going to use that in my ministry highlight, and then they never asked me to do the ministry highlight, so once again, kicked to the curb. But you don't serve on that committee looking for the glory. You don't serve on that committee looking for the pat on the back. You serve because you feel like that's what the talent that God's given you. And that's the way you have to take any talent that you feel that God's given you. You have to serve for His glory and for the glory of everybody else. The book that we've been reading is not a fan. And I like to pull a little bit out of it because it's such a good book. But there's a story here, and that's what I'm going to close with. And it's a story that's so true because it's real and it's authentic. And it's something that maybe doesn't affect a lot of us in here because, I know a lot of y'all. I've seen a lot of y'all get saved. I've seen a lot of y'all be baptized. I've been there when that's happened. So I know a lot of y'all's hearts. But I also know that it's easy to get skewed the other way. And it's easy to get off path just a little bit if you're not trying to stay on that all the time. But the story is a guy from Houston. It says, a few months ago I was speaking in Houston, Texas, and a good-sized man with a good-sized belt buckle came up to me with tears in his eyes. He began to tell me the story of his prodigal daughter, how she went to college and totally turned her back on the faith. As soon as he started the story, I knew how it would go. I've heard it so many times, even the details seemed predictable. But when he finished, he didn't ask me why she was doing this or what had gone wrong. He wasn't looking for an explanation. Instead, with one sentence, he put his finger on what he thought had happened, and here's what he said. He said, "We raised her in church, but we didn't raise her in Christ." We raised her in church, but we didn't raise her in Christ. And I don't think that there's a better example than that. How many people out here are we raising in the church, but we're not raising any of them in Christ? Or we're not putting the focus on what the actual meaning of the destination is. We raised her to look right on the outside, but we didn't teach her about the inside. We taught her to keep all the rules, but she never had an actual relationship. We made her feel guilty for the wrong things she did, but somehow we missed the only thing that mattered, and that's God's amazing grace. We taught her to be a fan of Jesus instead of being a follower of Jesus. And sadly, that's the way that a lot of people are living. A lot of people right here in our own community, a lot of people in our own church are living that exact same way. They've been raised to be a fan of Jesus, but don't understand what it means to actually be a follower of Jesus. Because we've muddied the water and put it in a point where it's not the actual direction that they're supposed to be going. We've changed the target, and we've got them aiming at a target that's either unattainable or unachievable or out here in the open, instead of pointing them at the only target that matters, and that's Jesus Christ and what it means to truly be following Him. So the question at the bottom, as we close, you don't have to answer it, but it's, were you or have you been taught to be a fan of Jesus instead of a follower of Jesus? And I think that's the lesson that if you don't take anything else from what we've talked about tonight, that's the question that I want you to think about, to study on, to meditate on as you think, is the target that I'm actually trying to achieve, actually following Jesus and what He has for me, or am I following some kind of legalistic, rules-based system that actually has no real impact in the kingdom of God, and actually is not what even I feel God maybe even called me to do, but I'm doing it because this is what's expected.